Going to do that council, coming together, reaching out to all of us and just sharing that.
In 2010, my father passed away, and some family and business took me to China. I'm firstborn American, Chinese on my dad's side of the family, and my wife and I both moved there to Hong Kong and Beijing, where we lived for almost 5 years. We really enjoyed our time, but it was time to move on. And so we moved back to Lake Tahoe. Pretty much 90% of my work is spent in the mountains here. It's interesting, I moved here from China to pursue work, and being back here on Donner Summit, where I've climbed and knew a little bit about the history, whether it be the Donner Party or how the railroads were built by the Chinese here, and I'm like, oh, I'm not the first person to move here from China and try to make a living and a better life for myself.
In the years after the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion. As the railroad was making progress, there was one really formidable barrier, and that was the 7,000-foot summit of the Sierra Nevada mountains. To build a railroad across these mountains, the Central Pacific turned to an unlikely workforce, the Chinese.
The builders of the railroad realized they didn't have enough workers to do the thing. So they said, well, let's try the Chinese who are here mining or doing other things like this. And they started the crew right here in Auburn. They realized that the Chinese was such a great workforce that they decided to start recruiting Chinese to the point where you almost had up to, we don't know the exact numbers, but there could be 12 to 20,000 workers coming, and made up 80 to 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce.
The location chosen to cross these mountains was Donner Pass on the present-day Tahoe National Forest.
There are 3 sites within the boundaries of the Tahoe National Forest related to the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad. These sites are all that remain and exemplify the incredible effort that it took to blast the railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains. China Wall was constructed by hand, block by block. It supported the original alignment of the Central Pacific Railroad. Summit Camp was a work camp. There were barracks, there were cookhouses, there were stables for horses. So it was definitely an area where there was a collection and a focus for work activities.
There were maybe 3,000 people at that camp that lived over there for over 2 years, building that tunnel in adjacent areas to the tunnel.
Construction of the Summit Tunnel was slow and laborious. Workers were only able to move 14 inches of rock a day. To blast through the granite, hand charges had to be set. Holes were drilled by hand using a drill and a sledgehammer. A charge was then set with black powder, and after the blast, a different crew would come in to remove the waste rock.
And it was through 2 of the worst snowstorms ever recorded in history. They were building this tunnel, which is 5 football fields long.
And I find that remarkable. That was 1866, 1867. Today it would be hard during summertime. To think about them doing that during the winter, I think is incredible.
This was the highest elevation tunnel ever built in the world at the time. They had to invent techniques to do this. And it was all done by hand. How could we do these things? It was really Chinese labor who changed America. It was an American project. It was designed, it was directed by Americans, built with American capital. But the hands, the feet, the labor, the sweat, the grunting, the pain, the death, the accomplishments were all Chinese-oriented.
The story of the Summit Tunnel itself, that term should be as compelling or evocative to us as when we hear the words the Trail of Tears, or the Underground Railroad, or the Oregon Trail, or Route 66. We need to tell that as part of our, and that's the collective our folklore.
In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is complete. Leland Stanford drove a gold spike into the last rail at Promontory Summit, Utah, and the nation cheered. The Transcontinental Railroad revolutionized trade. It united East and West. It opened up international markets from Asia all the way to Europe. And eventually it revolutionized the American economy, as well as the way that we travel. Here in my time, we have the internet that allows us to send email across the world or across the street in real time. These are analogous events, and they both changed how we live.
There's a chapter in American history that belongs to the Chinese, and that a lot of it has to do with the construction of the Transcontinental and how the Transcontinental Railroad transformed this country.
Following the completion of the railroad, this huge surplus Chinese workforce was no longer welcome. Pent-up discrimination and the introduction of more onerous laws and unfortunately common values that espoused hatred and prejudice caused many Chinese to return to China. It caused others to go off and do subtle work, but the drumbeat of discrimination and hatred towards Chinese people kept increasing, and that culminated in 1882 with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
So in 1882, Congress passed what might be called the first comprehensive immigration law, in which it excluded Chinese from immigrating to the United States, and then it prevented Chinese from becoming American citizens. It actually illustrates one of the tensions that occur throughout the American history from its beginning. Well, that tension has always been there. It's illustrated in the Chinese case that after we have built this railroad because we needed labor, so we bring in immigrants or people from another country. 14 years later, we then try to kick them all out.
Following the passage of the 1882 Act, the Chinese contribution to our country began to be forgotten or neglected, or maybe consciously excluded from our memory. By the early 20th century, not many people thought about this or even realized these things had happened. And in 1969, perhaps the biggest snub occurred at the centennial of the completion of the railroad.
A representative of the Historical Society was invited to be at that May 10th ceremony at Promontory. That individual was Bill Choi. So there was a lot of anticipation and a feeling that, took 100 years, but we're finally going to get our just recognition. He gets to the ceremony, and then he's told, "Oh, we are sorry, Mr. Choi, but we have taken you off the program because the program just doesn't have enough time." But then he had to sit through the keynote speaker, who was then the Department of Transportation Secretary, John Volpe, who said, "Who else but Americans could drill 10 tunnels in mountains 30 feet deep in snow. Who else but Americans could chisel through miles of solid granite? The snub in 1969 inspired a number of people to try to make it right.
In 2011 and 2012, we got both the Senate and the House to agree to resolutions that talk about, we'll actually put it into the official record then, the congressional record, the history of Chinese migration here, their contributions to the country, and the reactions which the United States had to them.
Another part of the effort was that at the appropriate milestone or celebrations, that our stories, the Chinese story, was covered, would be voiced.
The group's consensus was we couldn't just drop it. You had to form something that continued to tell the story.
Things began to change as the country neared the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike ceremony in 2019. This time, a lot of groups, including the U.S. Forest Service, the 1882 Foundation, the National Park Service, the Chinese Historic Society, and many other groups and individuals would work tirelessly to make sure that this time the story was told completely and accurately.
The U.S. Forest Service is proud to help tell this story. Working with these organizations, the U.S. Forest Service has jointly hosted the Return to Gold Mountain Tours. The Return to Gold Mountain Tour provides an opportunity for descendants of the Chinese railroad workers, educators, and members of the public to visit important Chinese cultural heritage sites within the boundary of the Tahoe National Forest.
So we are on a train from Reno to Sacramento as part of a historic tour. Shortly, I will be visiting both my paternal and maternal ancestral villages in the Pearl River Delta region in southern China. And as part of my preparation work, I started to talk to a great uncle, and then he revealed to me that I actually have ancestors that worked on the Transcontinental Railroad. So in many ways, I feel like my homecoming has begun.
The Forest Service is looking at opportunities to outreach to the urban, suburban populations, people that we might not normally connect with out on National Forest System lands. One way that we did this is going to the San Francisco Chinese New Year Festival, having a booth, bringing Smokey Bear, talking to kids, parents, families, any member of the public, telling them about the Return to Gold Mountain Tour, opportunities to sign up, giving them information about our Explore APA Heritage website, and giving them a booklet so they can visit the sites on their own if they can't make the tour.
And that's contributed to the public interest in the public lands, because it's something that you don't normally think about Chinese and the forest or the outside.
The Chinese historical sites within the boundaries of the Tahoe National Forest are so important. Many people don't realize they're there. Many people don't realize that this is a way that they can get to our National Forest System land and do something besides what we might think of as a traditional recreational opportunity. Hiking, camping, skiing, fishing, that type of thing. You can also go learn about our history, and it's our nation's living history.
On the Tahoe National Forest and many other sites, there's a renewed interest in the cultural history and the other cultural sites connected with these great events. So now you could really see the momentum as this story began to spread thanks to these people's efforts. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad is a huge story, but thanks to the contribution of the Chinese workers originally and the renewed enthusiasm of the people wanting to perpetuate their memory, the Chinese story became the dominant narrative connected with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad.
We could not have asked for better media coverage of the 150th and the story of the Chinese. Everybody picked up on the themes that we felt were important.
One could argue that the culmination of all of these efforts was the 150th anniversary celebration at Promontory Summit, Utah. This time, the current Secretary of Transportation had something different to say.
Today, at the 150th anniversary, of the Golden Spike Ceremony, marking the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, is a day to commemorate the contribution of railroads and the contribution and sacrifices of the railroad workers, including approximately 12,000 or more Chinese laborers, who risked everything to make the Transcontinental Railroad a reality. Building from the west, the Central Pacific Railroad hired 15,000 workers, of which 12,000 or more were Chinese immigrants. These workers of Chinese ancestry blasted and chiseled their way through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains, using manual hammer drills, pickaxes, and explosive. They dug 15 tunnels through pure, hard granite. An estimated 500 to 1,000 Chinese workers lost their lives. But the Chinese workers persevered and played a key role in building one of the greatest infrastructure projects in the world.
I think we can be very happy that the story of the Chinese contribution to the Transcontinental Railroad was finally told in all its glory.
But you know what is really heartening during the 1882 project was, as unknown as it was to so many people, how many surprised it was how welcoming people said, tell me more. Tell me more about this story. I want to know more details. I want it in our textbooks. I want it in our public records and so forth. That is encouraging.
And we had an elected official, or an appointed official, the Secretary of Transportation, speak on behalf of the country, acknowledging the contribution of Chinese workers. We couldn't have dreamt that in 1969.
That gives us hope for the creation or continuation of what it is that should be American, who are Americans, what that means, not just for my grandkids or to acknowledge the fact that my grandfather and great-grandfather, they were important in building this nation, but it's also for everyone else who is an American trying to become part of this American nation.
I'm so lucky that I get to even play here at all, and I hit the lottery that I've been able to make it a living working and playing in the places that I love. Those feelings and those opportunities wouldn't have been available if it wasn't for the people that came before me, like my father and the immigrants that originally came here from China as laborers to build our infrastructure, such as these railroads here in Donner Summit.
I think for me, I didn't really get a sense of the impact of my connection to this particular site until I walked through Summit Tunnel and then seeing that maybe this particular granite that I'm touching right now could be the same granite that my great-great-grandfather had touched.
The original immigrants, they created a legacy of coming here to the United States to pursue a better life. And I'm proud to be a part of that legacy.
check, I promise. My parents bought a cabin on Donner Summit, on a little lake that's called Lake Mary. It's a beautiful spot. It's right near Tunnel 6, the big tunnel that they've been talking about in the film. And here you see it as it looked when they purchased it. It's constructed of heavy snow-shed timbers. You know, the railroad had the option. They had every other section, and so when the snow sheds caught on fire, they just threw the stuff down on the side and then cut a bunch more trees and put up more. Anyway, these are really heavy. They're 8 inches thick, and then they're 16 to 18 inches in depth. And I don't know how they did that in the 30s to create this. And you can see there once was a door there where there's a window now, but actually there's a big fireplace. You'll see that. But then they found out that they couldn't get in the winter, so they had to move the door. Anyway, my family intended to use the cabin mainly for skiing, but it turned out that each summer my mom and I spent the entire school vacation there, and my dad, meanwhile, transformed the cabin into what you see today. Actually, it doesn't look anything like that today because it snows all the way up to the balcony. He really transformed it with rock work and carpentry, and it's just, it's a beauty. So because I was an only child, my mom always invited other children to come and spend the summer with us. Our cabin, I'm on the right, my mom's on the left there, and then the rest of them are imports. They would spend weeks at a time in our cabin. We hiked all over the summit, and one of our favorite outings was to the 1913 underpass that was built for the Lincoln Highway. And they put this so that the cars at the time didn't have to go over the tracks, and that was quite a feat. And it was built in 1913. It's called the 1913 underpass, but we called it the trestle, but it has no meaning at all. And so we kids would go down there and scramble up and put our ears on the track, which would be at the top there, to hear if the train was coming. Well, those tracks were pulled up in 1993. And now all the trains use what's called Track 2, which goes through a 2-mile-long tunnel that was drilled through Mount Judah in the early 1920s. So they all use that tunnel. Sometimes my mom and I would scramble up there with a sack and we'd collect pieces of coal. So I brought you a piece of coal. You can feel it later. This is 75-year-old coal. And we bring it in a sack, and then we use it on the coal stove, the wooden coal stove where my mom would keep us warm and make us dinner. Anyway, all that's to say that my heart's really in Donner Summit. But all that time that I was spending on the railroad tracks, I had no idea of the story of the construction, nor of the heroic work the Chinese had to do to make the Transcontinental Railroad a reality. In fact, it was only in the last 20 years or so that I have learned the whole story. So I can understand that visitors to the tunnels, and there are lots of them, are as unaware as I have been. But that only compels me all the more to do whatever I can to help raise awareness of the full story of the tunnels and the 2 years of hard labor and sacrifice that the Chinese endured while building them. That's only part of why I'm involved and why I'm here with you today. When I was in high school, each summer I rode horseback. You will go there. Oh, those are the Chinese laborers, and you've seen those pictures before. I forgot to put them there. Anyway, I rode horseback down an old road that was the Lincoln Highway, which was passable still when I was a kid, down to Donner Lake, and then I saddled up a bunch of horses and take people around the lake, and then I'd come back home the 3 miles. The road, the Lincoln Highway, followed pretty much you see the old snow sheds there. They're all built of wood, and followed the 3 miles. And this is a picture of the road, not when I was going on it. It didn't look anything like that. It was already pretty deteriorated, but you can see it would deteriorate pretty fast. So that highway followed the snow sheds and the tracks all the way down to Donner Lake. And this is when it was in its heyday. So, because the snow sheds were of wood, and I have another picture of, this is the beginning of Tunnel 6, the west end, in probably the late 1800s. And that hotel, I have even one of these little pointer things, this one here. That hotel there is the famous Summit Hotel, and then it goes into the tunnel right here. And you'll see other pictures of the entrance, the west entrance of Tunnel 6, in a couple more slides. Anyway, the wooden snow sheds were not very conducive to the graffiti that we're dealing with today. It wasn't a very good palette. But now they've been replaced with concrete. And so that's a much more usable painting canvas. And for the past 10 to 15 years, boy, they've really been painting. Once the trains no longer use the route, here's an example. Graffiti artists started covering the interior of Tunnel 6 and then the other tunnels. The entire interior surface is now covered with graffiti and tagging. And the more recent exterior tagging on the snow sheds is visible from nearby highways and from Donner Lake and even from Truckee. This is that underpass. And you can see, let's see if I can do this. That is what's the famous Donner Summit Bridge. We call it the Rainbow Bridge, and that's Old Highway 40. And then there's another highway that was built in the 60s that's a freeway. It's called I-80, which just bypassed all of this. So I'll get to that in a moment. Now people come to see the art, in quotes, with no idea what they're really experiencing when they go through the area. And some of the art is now itself crudely defaced by taggers, and much the recent tagging includes ugly profanity. The prospect that tagging might expand is not unfounded. There is the nearby China Wall that you heard about, and then just below that, on the granite slabs, are the 4,000 up to 4,000-year-old petroglyphs. For me, the degradation and disregard for the sacredness of the site are a personal affront. So on Donner Summit, there are a lot of us who love the area and its history, and we felt we had to do something about educating visitors and stopping the degradation. So we started with the education side. It started in 2008. The Donner Summit Historical Society started creating brochures. There they are. So there's a bunch of them. And I have show and tell. I have 2 of them, and there are enough copies that you can each have one later when we meet in the other room. These were made available not only to the visitors but also to the locals. Some of us had no idea what our backyard held as far as richness. And then I told you about the I-80. That meant that Donner Summit really suffered from an economic decline because Highway 40 had been the main road through the area, and it was bypassed in the 60s by the construction of that I-80. So also in 2008, in an effort to invite people to take the old highway, see the sites, and maybe spend a little money along the way, the Historical Society created the 20-mile museum. And this is a series of over 50 signs that are distributed from, oopsie, I think, yeah, that's right, from Cisco Road all the way into Truckee. So they're all along the road there, along Old 40. And the signs, as you can see, have the history of the area, some nice pictures and things to do right at the spot where the sign is located. And then finally in 2008, which is a very busy year for the Historical Society, they started this monthly heirloom, which deals with all the rich history of Donner Summit. It's anywhere from 16 to 24 pages. It's free, and you just have to go onto the Donner Summit Historical Society.org website, and you can read all about it. The current issue, since 2008, monthly notices is number 175. And this is all thanks to a wonderful guy named Bill Odegeest, who is the president of the Donner Summit Historical Society. And then in 2017, the community, led by my organization, the Donner Summit Association, converted this old fuel shed into and the surrounding area into a trail hub that offers organized parking for visitors and lots of information of great interest. It's very popular with people. They read the stories on the 12 faces of the kiosks. One of them is devoted, this one is devoted to the Chinese laborers. There's one devoted to Tunnel 6. And they stand there and read them. I mean, it's wonderful. You see the whole crowd of folks around there reading it. The railroad theme is reflected in these little carts that we put on the rails and the turntable. And the parking lot is almost always full or overflowing. And then behind the hub, over the shed, is the top of the shaft that was drilled into the middle of the famous Tunnel 6. And that allowed work on the tunnel to proceed from 4 directions simultaneously. And amazingly, all 4 phases met after 1,659 feet of drilling and almost 2 solid years of work. So in order for people to visit that, we made an accessible path up to it. There it is there. And one of the 20-mile museum signs, so people would know what they're looking at. So all of this is to give you an idea that the history of Donner Summit is finally being more widely disseminated and appreciated, with a focus on the railroad and the Chinese workers. However, there's always a however, a but. This is the entrance now to Tunnel 6, and we did clean it up. And then the railroad, Union Pacific, put this barrier there, but that doesn't stop anybody. And we cleaned it up once, but then we cleaned it up again, and we cleaned it up again. So the degradation is just horrible on the interior because it has these wonderful drill holes that are really relics of history, and they should not be defaced or hidden by being graffitied over. So the expansion of the problem seems to stem from an article in a local rag called The Moonshine Ink, written in June of 2013. The article extolled the art, in quotes, of the graffiti, and the author found these art pieces wonderful, and the tunnel was thrilled that she was able to visit and discover these markings. She claimed they will be available for future archaeologists to study and try to discern their meaning. Then in 2016, in response to the article and the ensuing increase in tunnel tagging, a group of administrators and staff from Sugar Bowl, which is the neighboring ski resort, met with officers of the Union Pacific Railroad and some community members to discuss how to remedy the problems of trespassing and the rampant defacing of the tunnels. And a couple of solutions were proposed. They thought maybe we could have a big tunnel cleanup day with a barbecue, or put up fencing or cameras, or a lot of signage, very aggressive signage, but nothing much came of the meetings. There were some sporadic efforts to paint over the graffiti. The Girl Scouts got together and did a little covering of it, but the tagging went apace. Then in 2020, we had COVID, and people flocked to the outdoors to get out of town, and they loved the summit, and the number of taggers exploded, and families discovered that a great outing is to go to the tunnels with their kids and spray cans and paint like crazy. So the Donner Summit Association was encouraged by the local, it really wasn't seen, you have to say. They were encouraged by the local climbing coalition. You saw those climbing, the faces that are near the tracks. I mean, they're world-class climbing sites. And so these climbers don't like to see the graffiti on the exterior of the snow sheds either. And so they said, hey, you guys, you be the ones to take ownership of the problem. So we did. We organized a community-wide graffiti paint over project. There was a lot of support. We had businesses and organizations, and they gave money and supplies and labor. And we had the Land Trust, and Kelly Paints, Mountain Hardware, the Forest Service, Sugar Bowl, bikers, rock climbers, even a sheriff's deputy joined us, many other individuals. So So we decided to concentrate on the exterior of the snow sheds, because painting over graffiti in the interior of the tunnels would only add to the desecration of the masterful work of the Chinese laborers and create a new canvas for taggers with more layers of paint and more degradation. The hope was that if we could get across that the tagging the exterior would be futile because we would subsequently obliterate it, then maybe tagging everywhere would slow or maybe even stop. That's what we thought. They even went up on the rocks, all the way up on the rocks to see how the painters are. So that's what it looks like afterwards. It's really ugly. I mean, we're not doing anybody any favors, but maybe the message would get across. That's what we were hoping. So in 2020, for 3 days in September, we had 70 volunteers. They spent 4-hour shifts with paint buckets, rollers, extension poles, and muskets. There were follow-ups, both that year and then the following year. Lots of organizing, hundreds of hours and dollars have been spent on this effort. One of our volunteers said it's messy, but it requires little skill, and it's relatively quick. The problem is that when we paint over the tagging, it's just a nice new canvas for the next tagger. And so it's really sort of an exercise in futility. So, and people come to look at it. I think it's really a great thing to see. This is my husband's red truck. And he goes through the tunnel with the permission of Union Pacific with the materials. And the fellow standing there is not my husband. But he is the former CEO of the Transcontinental Land Trust, which has done a lot to preserve much of the surrounding land for our future generations. So sometimes they paint on the rocks, you saw that. So we have to use a product, it's called Elephant Smile, I know the name. And it actually dissolves the paint, but it requires scrubbing and washing, and then the solvent has to be handled very carefully. We could put a protective coating over the surfaces to make removal of graffiti easier and faster, but this is very expensive and it requires access to water. So the hub was tagged soon after the siding was replaced, and so were the boulders that we put in front. But we immediately got to work with solvent and got that off of there, and then we put a protective coating on all of the area around the hub. And we haven't had any problem with it since. I don't know, maybe people just do respect it, but they should respect everywhere. Then we tried hiring a steward for 2 months who was to monitor the west entrance to Tunnel 6 and answer questions from visitors and record any suspicious behavior. And he did find some kids, he caught them. But we were told that local law enforcement had no intention of prosecuting anyone for litter or graffiti, so it's a pretty low return on our investment. We proposed to place cameras in the nearby parking lots, but that's not yet been implemented, because it would require constant monitoring and strategic placement, and you have to have a power source. We did place a sign at the entrance to Tunnel 6 that said, cameras are watching you, but nobody pays any attention because they don't see any cameras. Landmark will create the foundation that we need to build on. You know, we'll just try anything. I'll close with a quote from George Stewart. He's the historian who wrote and the author of Ordeal by Hunger, you know, about the Donner Party. A lot of other books about the area too. He said, Donner Summit has its beauty of high crags and gleaming granite. The view eastward across the Donner Lake is just as famous. What makes Donner Summit special is that it has kept a rendezvous with history, and its interest to the person who passes here should be historical as much as scenic, you know, and its interest should not include graffiti in the tunnels and on the snow sheds or the rocks. And our historian, Bill Sexton, wrote about this graffiti. It's a desecration, a shameful act that no one should be proud of or tolerate. It destroys elements of a very important history that should be preserved. And I'll stop before I say.
My mom taught me to be proud to be sixth-generation Chinese American. But in 6 generations, there's a lot that gets lost. I've been longing for a connection to our past. And being here this time made me realize how much I don't know. I grew up following in my mom's footsteps, but lately there's a distance between us, filled with things left unsaid. Why is it so hard for us to talk about us?
4 miles. Okay, please assist me. Clearly I need help with the directions.
Okay, in 0.3 miles you have to take the right.
Okay, I do see that. Thank you. No, it's good. You should. You pointing out and asking questions. Well, who was in the railroad? Who did this? It made me realize I have no idea. I've come up to Tahoe many times as a kid. Did not know our family connection with this.
We're going up the Sierra Nevada mountains and down to the Great Basin Desert, visiting the places our ancestors may have worked. A 150 years later, these are the remnants of their lives that were left behind.
There's all these pieces, little pieces everywhere.
This one's so intact though. Yeah, maybe it's like a can of some sort of canned food. I don't see a label.
Oh, wait, look, over here.
Oh my God.
That is so amazing. Ooh, whoa. That was good. Do one more to get the dirt out of it. It looks like it's a teacup because it's really fine and thin. Wow, that is really amazing. What do you think was in here?
Food to share. Wow, it's so thick. Oh my gosh.
I think this is the kitchen area. Like, what's happening here? What's the history?
What did your parents or grandparents tell you about your history?
Not very much. There was maybe a reference of our family working in the railroad, my grandfather working in the gold mine, my grandma being on Angel Island for a while. There's really not that many people that have this many generations in California. Our ancestors could have also been part of westward expansion, being oppressed and perpetuating oppression at the same time.
We've been conditioned to forget. We've been erased. When retracing our history, we get to see it in its complexities. But only when we see our part in the story.
Can you tell my birth story?
I was in labor for 38 hours. You got a fever, and then I got a fever, and they said, this is not good. Let's do a C-section. And I said, what? All I heard them say was, the head's too big. Then they cut more so that they could fit you out. Nobody quite tells you about how long that silence feels like. I was worried you were gonna die. And then you cried. There's so many fairy tales that I used to tell you when you're little about fish, about koi. It's woven a lot in Chinese mythology.
The story goes that Chinese laborers working for the Central Pacific Railroad brought catfish up here. Who knows how they made it all the way up, but they had to provide food for themselves. And the strange thing is that catfish don't usually survive at high elevation. Yet here they are at 7,000 feet, all these generations later.
It's mixed because in a way, you want to carry on the legacy. It's making me feel sad. Sad that I didn't ask more of those stories.
What about your scar?
It still hurts. It still hurts. It gets specifically painful when something is going on with you. When you are in a moment of pain, I get like a stabbing pain down there.
And when did you feel that last?
A couple of weeks ago. I hadn't for a while, so I was surprised by it. I actually called you, and you didn't answer. And I thought, oh, she's filming, she's doing something. I need to pay attention to my intuition more, because I didn't want to think that you were in pain.
This is a place of refuge. It was here Chinese workers who were chased out of town by a racist mob finally found safety.
What did you think when I asked you to come on this trip with me?
Well, anytime I get to spend time with you is good. So I thought, oh, wow. I was honored. I was honored to be asked.
There are things I wanted to tell you, but I just didn't know how. There's parts of my story that I'm not ready to share with everyone, but I want to share them with you. We have history here. I might not know just by looking, but now that I've touched these walls and walked this path, I feel it. Our family was here before there was a railroad or highway or state. Our family was here.
Pacific Railroads completed to a junction 1,086 miles west of the Missouri River and 690 miles east of Sacramento City, California. Leland Stanford, President of the Central Pacific Railroad. P.C. Durant, Sidney Dillon, John Duff, Union Pacific Railroad.
Well, good evening, everyone, and what a tremendous honor it has been to be part of this evening and to really be a part of this powerful story of our history. You know, the cultures, the families, the sacrifices made America what it was, what it is, and what it will be. And until we tell the whole story of all of us, then America's history is incomplete. So thank you for the gift tonight. So I'll begin by thanking the 1882 Foundation for organizing this wonderful event and to the Kennedy Center for hosting us tonight. As they said, my name is Angela Coleman. I am the Associate Chief of the U.S. Forest Service from the Department of Agriculture here in the federal government. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Forest Service, and you saw Smokey Bear, we are part of a federal family, we're a federal agency, and our job is to oversee 193 million acres of public lands, primarily comprised of national forests and grasslands. These are public lands that belong to every American. But we know in our country's history, there was a time when not all Americans were welcome and people were excluded from particular places. But please note today, the Forest Service values diversity of cultures, perspectives, and lived experiences. And we are committed to creating an equitable and inclusive environment that provides access and service to all. There is truly something for everyone to enjoy in our forests and grasslands. And so we invite, we encourage, we welcome all people to visit them and find a welcoming place, a haven in nature that we all can enjoy. So tonight, we are gathered to share more about the history of some of these special places, and we reflect on why it is so important to share culturally important stories. Within our Forest Service managed lands, there are places with stories that are almost forgotten. Chinese laborers, as we all saw in the beautiful movie, in the mid to late 1800s, left behind physical and cultural remnants of the past. And they have been woven into the fabric of our country, particularly in the western region of the United States. Evidence of their hard work and contributions remains scattered across the physical landscape in documents kept deep within the recesses of local historical societies and in our government records. And only in recent times are these historical documents, along with artifacts and stories, being shared more with the public so people can learn, so people can know about the value that Chinese laborers brought to this country, to our country, and the development of the West. And the Forest Service is committed to preserving and sharing culturally important places in history. Many of you in this room may be aware that as you know now, that the Summit Tunnel near California's border was listed as one of America's most endangered historic places in 2021 by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I understand the importance of being able to relate to a place with heart. We know a little something about that in this country. The Forest Service has partnered with the 1882 Foundation, along with the Chinese Historical Society of America, to spotlight these Chinese immigrants' incredible contributions, and we will ensure we remember their legacy. Our goal in this partnership is to connect the Asian community to their public lands, to their history, to their heritage. We are achieving this through outreach events such as the interpretive tours over the Donner Summit and participation in the Chinese New Year events in San Francisco's Chinatown. Through these programs, we aim to build an awareness and understanding of interrelationships between people and the land. The Forest Service, of course, can't do this alone. We need partners to help us share these stories. And our collaborative efforts make this story even more powerful and our connections even stronger. We offer a heartfelt thanks to those who played the key role in bringing this work to fruition. I commend those in this room, Ted Gong and Phil Sexton, former Forest Service, always Forest Service, from 1882's Foundation. Sue Lee, the Chinese Historical Society of America. Where are you, Sue? There you are. Barbara Wyatt, retired National Park Service employee, and Scott Baxter, who I sat next to, had the honor, you never know who you're sitting next to, our independent archaeologists, who all have worked hard to get this story out there. They worked so tirelessly toward the Summit Tunnel gaining National Historic Landmark designation. We also thank Joe Flannery for making the film Legacy. While working for the Forest Service, he's done such a tremendous job of telling the story. And I'm grateful to our friends at the Bureau of Land Management for partnering with us and contributing the funding in order to create Tracing History. Thanks also go to the production company Breaktide for producing such a touching film. And we recognize Hilda Kwan, the Mendocino National Forest Environmental Coordinator, who worked with partners to make tonight's event a reality. And lastly, we thank Ellie Alano, our Forest Supervisor on the Tahoe, and Liz Berger, who was the Deputy Forest Supervisor, but now is in our offices in California, for their efforts. And I'm sure, looking around this room, there are many others that I need to thank that I did not mention. Well, I thank you as well. Because of your hard work and the hard work of others, the story of the Summit Tunnel is getting told and shared with broader audiences, and the contributions of early Chinese immigrants to the United States continue to be fully recognized. And many, including myself, watch these films. We are inspired. We learn more and want to become involved more in historic preservation. So thank you again for this evening. It was a powerful evening for me, a great way to kick off a vacation. And thank you so much for having me here. Please enjoy the rest of the day.
So I always start off with aloha kako to everyone. Good evening. It's so nice to be here with all of you tonight as the Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. It is a mouthful. So we go by the acronym WIONP for short. Some of you may have worked with prior iterations of our initiative. We have actually existed for over 2 decades. We were first created under the Clinton administration in 1999 and have been reauthorized under every administration, both Democratic and Republican, ever since then. And most recently, we were reauthorized in May of 2021 through President Biden signing of Executive Order 14031 to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for our diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And I just really want to commend Ted. We do go way back, and so I was, prior to joining the administration in the summer of 2021, I was the executive director of KPAC, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and I know you'll be hearing a message from my former boss, Congresswoman Judy Chu, shortly. And in that work together, we were able to really advocate to ensure that Americans were aware of not just the contributions of the Asian American community, but in particular the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And I really want to thank Ted and the 1882 Foundation for helping to shed light and also to pass a resolution of regret to acknowledge that really painful chapter in our nation's history. I think, unfortunately, what far too many of us have seen over the course of the past nearly 3 years, and of course a lot of this was spurred and really exacerbated throughout COVID-19, was a rise in anti-Asian xenophobia, hatred, and violence. And unfortunately, we are still seeing remnants of this even to this day, where we continue to hear from communities about their fear for their own safety, walking in their own neighborhoods, and also fear of being attacked and singled out just because they are of Asian descent. And I think for us, we know that in addition to doing all that we can, the president has made very clear that xenophobia and racism is completely unacceptable in any form. But we also know that we can't just address hate crimes after they happen. We have to be proactive in getting to the root cause of what is actually driving the xenophobia. And unfortunately, again, as I mentioned, so many people see Asian Americans, people who look like me, people who look like many of us in this room, as perpetual foreigners, despite how long we have been in this country. And just looking behind me at this picture, seeing, again, these are generations of contributions that have been made by Asian Americans, Chinese railroad workers, who toiled and who are, part and parcel to the story and the very fabric of America. We see, despite that, generations later, their descendants are still being treated as foreigners, treated as, with suspicion, as not being loyal enough or not being American enough. We've seen this with even my old boss, Congresswoman Judy Chu, where people have questioned her loyalty to this country just because she is Chinese American, and that is completely unacceptable. So I am really grateful that we have a president and a vice president who truly see our communities, who understand the value and the contributions that Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have made, both recent immigrants, but also those who have been in this country for generations, including our Indigenous, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And so I really want to just, again, thank you all for the honor to be here today. We know how critical it is to be able to recognize and honor the rich legacy of our Chinese American communities, and in particular, the Chinese railroad workers who helped to build and connect our country through the first Transcontinental Railroad. As Ted mentioned, just a couple of years ago, we celebrated the 150th anniversary, and to know that, back then, the Chinese railroad workers were not even allowed to be in the picture. Their stories were completely erased, and to see, now over 150 years later, that we are able to really, truly recognize their contributions, but also to make sure that, we can all do our part to ensure their memory lives on. And so one thing I'm really proud about under this administration is the fact that this president has really made it a priority to have diversity throughout the administration, including in the cabinet. And I think many of you know that we've seen so many Asian Americans appointed to positions, really significant leadership positions, including just recently Julie Su, who is a very proud Chinese American, who was appointed by the president to be our next Secretary of Labor. And we're all extremely proud of Julie. When she is confirmed, she will be one of 4 Asian American women in the president's cabinet, and that is very significant because having voices that represent our diverse communities doesn't just lead to a more diverse picture. It's not just for the sake of diversity, but we actually bring, to bear lived experiences, understanding of our diverse histories, and also making sure that voices that have not historically been represented have a seat at the table at the highest levels of government. And so currently, Julie Su is at the Department of Labor as the Deputy Secretary and now as the nominee to serve as Secretary. She has made it very, for her, just a really critical part to ensure that the contributions of our Asian American laborers are included throughout our history and throughout, the federal government. We also have another really great example of this in former Deputy Secretary of Labor Chris Liu, who, while he was in office at the under the Obama administration in his role, actually recognized the Chinese railroad workers in the Department of Labor's Hall of Honor, and that was the first time that was ever done. So, we have made significant strides, I think, as a community. There's still, of course, a lot of work to do to address the rise in xenophobia and racism and violence we are seeing. But again, so much of that work is, can be done together with all of you in this room. And I do want to also thank everybody here. I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of longtime champions in the community who have fought for us to have a voice, a seat at the table, and also to ensure that, again, our histories, our stories are, preserved and also uplifted beyond our communities, because we know how critical that is. And to that point, I want to just, really highlight and underscore that, like I said earlier, we do have a president who cares very deeply about making sure that the diverse histories and stories of all communities are uplifted under this administration. In particular, just last July, or actually it was in June of last year, the president signed Congresswoman Grace Meng's bill that will start the process to create our first ever National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture here in Washington, D.C. And we're just getting started. So there's a lot of work we know we need to do, but I think, again, just know that you have a president, a vice president, and an administration that truly cares about uplifting the diversity of our country, our stories, and making sure that every American has a place here in this country and is seen and heard. So thank you so much, mahalo nui loa, for the honor to join you tonight. I really appreciate it.
One of the supporters, originally supporters of the 1882 Foundation, was Judy Chu, and she unfortunately was not able to come tonight. She has some pressing business back home in Los Angeles, and she left a message, and I'm going to read that to you. Unfortunately, too few Americans understand how integral Chinese labor was to modernizing our nation's trade and transportation, or how exploited and unjustly treated these laborers were. That is why I am so glad that the 1882 Foundation and the Kennedy Center are hosting this event to educate us all on the Summit Tunnel. Chinese laborers were some of the first Asian immigrants to America. They comprised more than 80% of the Central Pacific Railroad that was tasked with completing the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, which included digging the Summit Tunnel, a 1,659-foot tunnel crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains and boring through some of the hardest rock in North America. Despite their essential contributions, the stories of Chinese railroad workers at the Summit Tunnel and beyond aren't always included in U.S. history books, especially the exploitation and unjust treatment and conditions they face. These Chinese laborers worked under treacherous conditions to lay tracks, break through granite, and plant explosives to blast through mountains. They were often tasked with the most dangerous jobs, and were also the targets of intense discrimination and violence. As a result, nearly 1,200 of these laborers lost their lives during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, including many from snowstorms, gas explosions, and more at the Summit Tunnel project. And yet, when it came down for the famous Golden Spike celebration to mark the celebration of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10, 1869, the Chinese railroad workers were purposely left out and were not included in the famous Golden Spike photograph. Over 150 years later, programs like tonight's are essential to increase public awareness of the history of the Chinese railroad workers and their unprecedented contributions to this country, even in face of racism and adversity. By honoring the sacrifices of these pioneers and sharing their stories, we can ensure that the future generations recognize the importance of their role in shaping American history. Judy provided that for us.